Ready?
We're ready to get started.
Cool. What's up, guys? For those who don't know, my name is Taemin Pak. I'm a senior engineer here at Riskalyze. And today I'm going to be talking about React Native and kind of my experiences building our very first mobile application. And so we're going to start with what is React Native. React Native, for those who don't know, is a framework created by Facebook. And basically, it allows you to build native applications using only JavaScript. And it uses the same design principles as React and the same fundamental UI building blocks as regular iOS and Android apps and their related native languages. So Swift for iOS and Kotlin or Java for Android. The only difference is we just put those blocks together using bundled JavaScript. So these are some pretty big companies that use React Native currently. Facebook and Instagram, obviously, because they created the language. But other big ones are like Tesla, Uber, Walmart, and very recently us. So I wanted to start with why one wouldn't use a native language when deciding to build a mobile application. Native languages definitely have their pros, right? The biggest one, I think, so for Swift, for example, the biggest thing is they've been around, Apple supports it, it's tried and true method of creating an application. And it usually has a slight performance boost because, again, it doesn't need to worry about any JS bundling and less memory consumption because, again, it doesn't need to worry about any JS bundling. Some of the cons are that it's usually much harder to learn. Not harder because the language is more difficult to learn, but it's just one more thing that your web developers will need to know. So if someone already knows JS, then having them embark on learning Swift or Kotlin could be kind of a big undertaking. And obviously, if you learn native language, you can only use it on the native platform. So Swift for Apple, Java, C++, Kotlin for Android. And ultimately, this can lead to slower development times because you have to build an entire team just to build an app specific to a platform. So you're going to have an iOS team, and you're going to have an Android team, each with their own languages trying to mirror the application building concurrently. And that's kind of where React Native steps in with, I think, its biggest advantage. It's capable of working with both Android and iOS. They're both going to be based off the same JS code that you write. And so you can have the same developer building for both platforms. And I personally found that 80 to 99% of the code was recyclable. And so I got to basically reuse almost every component I built in React Native for both platforms. It's way easier to learn if you're already coming from a web development or React background. Like myself, React was kind of all I knew, and web development was kind of all I knew, but I got to jump into React Native and mobile development very quickly because I had already established that React understanding. And so it usually has quicker development times through things like hot reloading, which is a React Native feature that basically it finds the differences in files and reloads the app at that specific point in the file. This is different from live reloading, which would reload the entire application, even if you made one small change, like a console log or something. React Native is a trending framework currently for mobile development, and I think that's pretty helpful for employers and employees in terms of finding employees to work for you, and if you're an employee, finding a job. And one of the, I think, key benefits of React Native that not a lot of people talk about is you're actually able to integrate native code with React Native. So if you are a Swift developer and you want to use React Native, you can actually build things in Swift and have it work in conjunction with your React Native JS code, which I think is pretty cool. So why not React Native? As mentioned before, it uses more memory with slightly less performance than native languages like Swift because you're going to always have to be wondering if your JS is compiling and building. It's a young, I don't know if it's young anymore, it's young-ish framework by Facebook, which means constant updates and changes. To me, that was the biggest killer, or the hardest thing about working with React Native is just the constant updates. And I'll get more into that later. And if you want to use certain native platform features, like the camera, Touch ID, things native to the device, your only options are using core APIs built by Facebook for React Native, or third-party packages, or you have to know how to actually write native code like Swift and Java, etc., which would kind of defeat the purpose of using React Native. So this is a short demo of a guy building something in React Native. We're not going to watch all of it because it's really long, but there's parts of it that I think is helpful, which starts here. How do I get sound?
You won't have it.
Really?
Yeah.
Really? All right, so we're not going to watch the video? Oh, you're not kidding right now. All right, so this is basically what your code base will look like when you're building an application. If you're familiar with React, you can see he's importing React up there, extending React component. And you can see even the JSX styling is really similar to React. But the main difference he goes over in this video, if we had sound, was that basically the JSX you're using for React Native is not the same as web development, right? You can already tell there's differences like Vue as opposed to div. Same with styling. It looks like CSS, but it's not actually CSS. You're importing a style sheet built custom by React Native. You're creating this object, style object, and attributing these properties, but it's not CSS. It's custom built in by React Native for styling. The second half of this video, I wish you told me there was no sound. So this is what the build process actually looks like after you build code. You have an emulator up there, and you'll see this Metro bundler come up. This is kind of React Native's equivalent of Webpack. It bundles your JS code for you and builds it to the, whichever device or emulator you have up. In this case, he's doing, I think, Android, so that's probably a Pixel phone. And you'll see right there on the bottom, it says building 79%, and that number will eventually go up. This is honestly the worst part about mobile development is everything takes so long. This is like, and then once the Metro bundler is up, you have to wait for that to get to 100%. And it will eventually. So all that to render those 3 lines of text. But it's only on initial load. Once you have the Metro bundler up and running and he's going to start changing JSX code here, then you'll see that it can render relatively quicker. I don't know what he's talking about right now. So he's enabling hot reloading. The main difference between hot reloading and live reloading, I think I said this earlier, is live reloading boots up the entire application again. Hot reloading will only look for those file changes. And you'll see the text change. And that's really similar to how React works. If you're familiar with React, when you make a code change, the code change is compared against your virtual DOM as opposed to the actual DOM. And then if there's a change between the virtual DOM and the real DOM, then it'll update the real DOM. And in that way, React's really performant. And they kind of mirrored that here when they invented hot reloading. Whew. All right. So what is React Native actually like in development practice? I found that development really was as quick and seamless as they had advertised. I think from day one, I was able to get in and start building screens right away. But I found that everything else other than the dev process really slowed me down. So like mobile development is very, very different from web development. And I'll get into that in the later slides, but that really affects the main benefits of React Native, right? Which is taking a web developer or any JavaScript developer, throwing them at a mobile project and hoping they're gonna be able to be productive from day one. That's not quite realistic, I think. And I'll go more into detail about that later. So the main differences I found between mobile development and web development was that in mobile development, you have to build on emulators or real devices. You're not going to be using a browser, obviously. And the biggest design issue that I found is you need to be way more conscious of screen size. And so the difference between a 4-inch screen and a 5-inch screen, even though it's only 1 inch, is drastically more impactful than the difference between like a 13-inch monitor, 15-inch monitor, or even like a 24-inch monitor. And so we found early on that design actually played a huge role. And so as a developer, I think it's very important that you work hand in hand with design so that they're aware of, hey, some of these designs are kind of not realistic. You can't shove all this information onto one page. It's going to look like crap on a smaller phone, things like that. Especially considering that tablets are considered mobile devices as well. For those who don't know, iPads actually run on iOS, and Apple will require your app to be compatible with an iPad, which means now you're dealing with screen sizes from 3.5 inches to like 15 if you have a giant iPad. And then the other thing was you have to build familiarity with Android Studio and Xcode. Both of those are IDEs for the respective iOS and Android platforms. And so building familiarity with those tools I found took longer than developing anything in React. And then obviously you need to worry about things that you'd never do on the web, like implementing Touch ID, dealing with mobile app stores, and worrying about camera placement, notches, things that you just don't really think about as a web developer. So these are the main tools you have to be familiar with if you want to get into mobile development and actually release the thing. Is Xcode. It's the IDE that contains the tools to develop for macOS, iOS, watchOS, tvOS, and very recently Apple is now fragmenting iOS into iPadOS. So iPad will now have its own operating system. I do not know how React Native will handle that. We'll all find out together soon, I guess. In my experience, Xcode is much more intuitive and easier to use than Android. Similarly, how iOS is way easier to use than Android. But yeah, Android, the main benefit that Android has going for it, I would say, is their Play Store. It's way easier to get applications into their Play Store. That's not to say they don't QA your APKs or do a thorough check of what you're uploading, but they're a lot less strict on what gets passed into release. And I also found that they reply pretty quickly to emails, whereas Apple, I found, or our product manager knows, takes days to get back with the most unhelpful responses. Yeah, so Apple, for the Red Tail folks, our biggest problem with getting into the Apple App Store was we're considered a financial institution or financial company, and so they basically forced us to build in-app purchases within our application, even though we had no intention of selling our product through our mobile app. And so for the longest time, we kind of fought them on that. It's like, eventually we had to build in-app purchases, had to build in a screen where we can sell our product so that Apple can take their 30% cut if we were to ever make a sale through our mobile app, which we won't ever sell it, but you still have to build it as if you can. Yeah, and it needs to be fully functioning. You need to test that the purchasing goes through, that you need to hit Apple servers, you need to verify your receipts, all of it. And so I think you guys are a financial company too, so I would expect that for sure. So the biggest challenges I found while building this application was building familiarity with Xcode and Android Studio for sure. That was the most time-consuming thing. It still is the most time-consuming thing. And then building familiarity with Apple and Google and all the politics that goes into that, setting up the online accounts on iTunes Connect or Google Play Store, depending on where you're trying to do it, filling out tax documents, setting up pricing, uploading screenshots across all the device sizes, iPads, et cetera, et cetera. Everything takes longer, building your code, running it on an emulator, running it on a device. You have to always be plugging things into your computer, and you have to have extra USB slots. And if you develop on a MacBook Pro, then you know that you're using USB-C slots, so I have to have a bunch of dongles. And then testing. Testing is super intense on one machine because, as I mentioned before, you're doing mobile development, but mobile is super broad, right? You have Android, you have iOS, and then within iOS, you have iPhone 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all with different sizes, all with different notches, all with different camera placements. And so when you fix the design for one, like let's say I fixed the design for iPhone 6 and it looks pretty good on the small screen, it might look terrible on an iPhone X or an XS Max. And so anytime you make one change, you need to run it on all devices and sizes to make sure that it's running the way you expect it to. On top of that, Android even has more variances. I think they're at like 2,000 plus different models of Androids. And they put their notches literally anywhere. And so because you're running the same JS code for iOS and Android, you really need to make sure your design is compatible with kind of anything. And so I found that to be the most taxing on my machine, is just running so many emulators and building to so many physical devices all the time. I kind of went over this, but the introduction of the notch in iPhones and Androids have made design a lot harder. And then versioning. So I'm currently going through this right now. with Android Studio, but you need to always be aware of what React Native version you're using, what Android Studio version you're using, what Xcode versioning you're using, what Gradle version you're using, what build.gradle version you're using, and what package dependencies you're using and what versions those are on. And if any one of those are not in sync, then you're not going to be able to build a release APK for Android. And it's not fun, but that's definitely, I would start early, and even if you're not ready to release your app, I would continually build release applications just to see if you can monthly. And then if some versioning is out of whack, you can fix it a little bit at a time. We did not do that because we did not know that this would be a big issue. And so now I'm having to like guess which 6 different versions might work together. And it's not fun. So recommendations I would have if you are choosing to build your app with React Native is have an Android person and an iOS person. And what I mean by that is both people are going to be developing in React Native. Both people should be versed in JavaScript and React. But things like uploading the app, things like building familiarity with Play Store, with Android Studio, it would be better if one person was really good at all the Android stuff and one person was really good at all the iOS stuff. And then both of you guys can develop the JS code together. Design is super important. I think early on in the process we realized that, and it was really helpful to work with Erica to make sure that our designs were on point and that it made sense and that we weren't, again, trying to shove too much information onto the mobile screen. And then something that was kind of specific to us, but we set up a backend service to deal strictly with mobile API calls, and more than once that's been very helpful to us in our dev process. So would I personally recommend React Native? Yes. I know I spent more time talking about all the bad times I had with it than all the benefits of it, but at the end of the day, React Native is so much better, easier, and cheaper than learning a brand new language, learning how to write native code, and then separating it into 2 teams and building an Android team and Android native code and a iOS team. And even while I was building this mobile project, I was still able to contribute to web projects on the side. I think React Native does a good job of making sure your React skills don't go stale just because so many of the concepts go hand in hand. And I'm very doubtful I could have built an iOS and Android app separately while learning Swift and Kotlin at the same time, while still contributing to our web app in the same time period. So I absolutely think it delivers on what it promises. So React Native in the future, just in the last year, there's been over 2,500 commits from 500 plus contributors. And so support is going pretty strong. That said, they did lose some big companies that used to write their mobile code in React Native. Airbnb is a big one, obviously. I think when Airbnb left, Facebook kind of took a step back and was like, oh man, we need to fix React Native for real. And so they kind of doubled down on their efforts, and they're going through projects right now to rewrite React Native to be more of an all-in-one stop solution. And so less dependency on third-party libraries and more built-in things into React. And so hopefully 2019 to 2020 going further, you'll literally be able to do anything and everything in pure JavaScript and never have to worry about any native code. And then these changes hopefully will improve the performance and reliability of React Native as a framework. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.